Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we have Barsoom to kind of start with a new book club podcast. We've read the first 3 chapters, and I've got some mixed feelings about these chapters. Not gonna lie. The first chapter with Edgar Rice Burroughs appearing himself, I was not terribly impressed by. The notion of John Carter never seemingly aging is something I'd rather overlook. Thankfully, the movie didn't really present this and directly contradicted this point from the novel. As, well, let's be blunt. The never aging hero who's perfect sounds like a Mary Sue. And let's leave that to the realm of the Star Wars expanded universe with Mara Jade and Ahsoka Tano and Rey. But that said, this is a detail which thankfully you can quickly forget about and not really think too much on. And the truth of it is, the first chapter, or prologue I should say, doesn't introduce much about John Carter. Honestly, he's not fully explained, but it's mentioned in there that when he passed, the idea was that Burroughs would become the executor of his will and would receive all his journals or diaries and whatnot. And honestly, we'll get to this prologue later again. The second chapter, or chapter 1, is, or chapter 2, sort of, is where John goes off to become a proctor for, well, gold. He's involved in an Arizonan gold rush, and he finds some, but his partner in crime, so to speak, although they're not really criminals, given that they're minding their own business. His partner in business ends up getting killed by some local natives, which fits given the violence of the natives of the era. The whole notion of the peace-loving native is something that is the most fanciful myth of all times. As one particular movie had Colonel Nelson point out.
We're dealing with the Apache. They weren't exactly known for peaceful diplomacy.
Very few of the tribes were. They had to be to survive because, well, it was a violent era. I'm just saying. And one has to bear in mind that the Apache and Comanche tribes were near where the Aztec once ruled. You had to be violent. Well, between them and the Toltecs, you had to be violent to survive, as these were not exactly pleasant people. They were so violent and evil in some ways that Cortez looked angelic compared to them, which Cortez was pretty psychotic and evil himself. So, yeah. That being said, Carter goes there looking for gold, ends up wounded and dead, and transported to Mars into a new body. Chapter 3 is when it gets actually kind of interesting. He runs into some hairless, multi-limbed Martians who start trying to capture him, as they're not entirely familiar with him, until one of them decides to kind of lure him over in a more friendly manner. As, you know, it's easier to just lure someone over with honey rather than bullets. Only for, well, yeah, John Carter, though, had initially tried to escape them via Superman jumps. I don't know what else to call it. Or Hulk jumps, given that Hulk became famous later on for his huge bounds. which would take him from one canyon to another or something, or one mountain to the next. John Carter basically did that first. And then he got captured foolishly by the Martians, or the Green Martians, I think it is. As well, everybody's got to have their stupid moment. And I'm actually going to praise this. I only took a look at the next chapter title to find out just what's going on in the next chapter. Apparently, Carter was a little trusting here, and no good deed goes unpunished. And Carter mistakenly wants to believe in the best in these creatures because he doesn't know them or understand them. So he falls for the most basic of tricks, which shows a bit of a naive streak there. This in spite of the fact that the business he was involved in was pretty ruthless work. So, yeah, but the Green Martians themselves are riding around on some pretty strange beasts, which I believe I've got a description right here. Let's see. It's mentioned that the Martians are, for their part, very large and are muscled only in proportion to the gravitation which they must overcome. Yeah, that's an interesting detail. I've got it somewhere around here in my notes regarding the creatures they were riding on. But yeah, he ends up having to deal with some hatching babies. And this is why the Martians were keen to capture him, because they were worried for their children, which, once they realized he wasn't going to hurt them, they were fairly relieved. But, here it is. These creatures are devoid of hair. They have a dark slate color and are exceedingly smooth and glossy, with white bellies and legs shaded from the slate of the shoulders and hips to a vivid yellow at the feet. And the feet were apparently noiseless when walking. And apparently it's established that there are no creatures with hooves on Mars at all. So this is pretty interesting. Now, John is writing from later in the timeline, sort of, at a later date, when he knows this is Mars. But at the time of the adventure, he doesn't actually know it's Mars. So you have actually a bit of an interesting frame narrative there. But, excuse me. But that said, the frame narrative's problem is that you have Edgar Rice Burroughs directly involved. And the only reason that's a problem is that it's not terribly interesting as how do I put it? As said, you have the whole thing with some of the conditions for the will, such as when Bryce Burroughs can publish everything, and the notion of Carter not aging. These are major details that, like I said, I tried to ignore. But ironically, I didn't mind the frame narrative too much in the movie, but in the book, yeah. But yeah, the first bit of the movie seems to be a pretty apt showing of the book, which, okay. But overall, the fact that there are no hooved creatures is pretty interesting stuff. So, yeah. But anyways, what did you think?
I could tell that this was a serial of the time, because I could tell that the style was meant for that.
Mm-hmm.
and would have been popular in that in the day.
Yeah.
But as mentioned, the first couple of chapters I found rather dry.
Oh, yeah, the first two aren't great. The third chapter is pretty good.
It gets better.
Once Carter is actually on Mars, it's interesting. But in the lead up, well, actually, I kind of liked him in the Arizonian canyons and desert and whatnot. I didn't mind that too much, but I did find it could be better. Ironically, the movie put all this drama and action at the start when on Earth. I actually kind of preferred that. The book was not as interesting with the Earth stuff. But Mars, the book is actually, when you get there, it's pretty interesting. So, but if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were John Carter himself smashing one of his enemies to itty bitty pieces.